So Heidegger says for the Abendlandish philosophy, and that guy in the New York Times, the Zizek, because he's trying to be relevant, mentions, I forget his name. He put out a lot of books that are published widely. Simon something or another. He wrote it. I'm talking about the guy that wrote the New York Times sort of expose on how to understand being in time, and then he came out with the wrong-headed interpretation that Heidegger is the philosopher of possibility. So Heidegger himself says that for this philosophy, his Abendland or Western Abendland, evening land, Western philosophy, the same as Spengler means when he's talking about the Untergang or the downgoing or the setting of the Western agathon or sun that Hegel has mentioned in the beautiful metaphor of the blind man having come into possession of sight, meaning the first philosophers in the, as it were, archaic West before the classical Athenians came to do their syncretic work and put all the views together, consider them all on an even plane. Which one is the Pythagoreans better, and what's the origin of these? Is it the Egyptian hierophants and blah blah blah. But Heidegger is saying, as the leading representative of this thought, and then that makes people like this New York Times guy pretty mad. It's like, what arrogance! Heidegger thinks he's so full of himself. His view is the Seinfrage is the thing that both conserves the tradition and allows the tradition to conserve us. And so Kristen Stewart had said the terrifying thing is it doesn't stop, so life doesn't stop. I think she has a keener perception of this than everyone else, because her personality is more intense than the rest of us, because let's put it in this simple sense, there's sensitivity to things, which sometimes comes off as kind of smoothness, which sometimes comes off as anxiety, as in people say, for instance, the guy that was Anthony Perkins in Orson Welles' version of The Trial is always anxious. Whereas in contradistinction, we could say Charlton Heston is not very anxious. I think Anthony Perkins is the right role for Moses, but he would have never been cast, because that's not the way people think of Moses. Just as the people don't think of that passage in the book of Genesis as Cain saying, almost in a sort of plaintive way, is he my brother? Is Abel my brother? In other words, do I have to look out for him morally? But we like the view, it's become popular to have this philosophic, modern, cynical Peter Sloterdijk view, which says, which makes it into a sardonic statement. Where's your brother? I don't know. Whatever, rather than what the text actually says, which is, I didn't know. So it's an initial awakening to the problem. So these problems are real, and they arise in utterly strange way. But just because they're utterly strange doesn't mean they aren't also the most scientific and the most serious questions. So this is what Heidegger is able to stabilize with, and the Frage attacks that. So when we have this problem of time, we have at the same time this problem which I think it arises when we take, for instance, age seriously. And instead of regarding age as a question like, oh, there's this technological object. So just in the same way that workers cease to exist and salaried people start to exist. And the meaning of this in the 1930s is basically like federal totalitarian policy influences everything everyone does, so that even though there's like maybe there could be even more than 50% of people that don't work for large corporations, but they still work for a large corporation in the sense that even if you work for the tiniest, most independent business, you're under the regulations of the federal government, and they can switch it around all the time. And at the same time, you're under the forces of the way the Fed makes the sausage, which is the value of the currency. And whether or not it's real, I think it's real. The debt, Donald Trump wants to increase the debts because people like Schwartzman and other people are like, we own a lot of long-term bonds. So you listen to Jamie Dimon, for instance, he says, well, the short-term bonds, big deal. But the long-term bonds, that seems to really tell us something. We have to stay in an equilibrium with respect to that. And then you find out that maybe the reason the big, beautiful bill is raising the debt by $5 trillion is because that's how they don't want, it's not just that they don't want a diminution of their annual incomes. It's that their unconscious religion is the gangsterism, and it's a Hobbesianism. So the Hobbesianism or the gangsterism means, I think that me and mine, my near and dear, are better off as long as my income increases. And the way to make my income more stable and to increase it is the big, beautiful bill that adds to the vig on the, to put it in Sopranos terms, on the debt. So I think it's like here we could see that what we deal with in terms of questions of whether we're in a totalitarian state or not. So the totalitarian state is the state where the federal government is reaching into everything. Everything becomes a technical question. The field of economics influences everything in daily life to an extent. The value of the dollar, for instance, the regulations that I just pointed to a little bit on, even on the smallest business, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's not just a matter of being corporate capture, but it's also a matter of totalitarian capture of that laws and regulations touch on everything, so that something like Milton Friedman, or even in the higher state, Hayek, like questions on libertarianism, on the Federal Society tact, on et cetera, on small government. Here, there's a guy called Joseph Raz, who's supposed to be one of the big authorities on these questions between people like Leo Strauss and people who put forward legal positivism. Has said there's something called moral fetishism. So that, I mean, once we start to think that morality has to do with our conditions, but how can we get out of our conditions? Because we have to face up to the real conditions. That's how we're pummeled down by our real conditions. and then we feel like we have some part of ourselves, maybe it's the main and leading part in certain cases, that has access to the truth. um, Kelsen, for instance. But then, whatever our convictions are, we ask ourselves, can we impose our convictions ruthlessly as though we were the Aristotelian uh, perfect gentleman, the one who is magnanimous in victory and fair in victory? Can we genuinely impose these conditions on everyone, or do we have to have some kind of vote where the most ignorant, the loudest, the most evil people have just as much say as everyone else because everyone is in some defeatist way equal, or what? And so this is a huge struggle.